well, please do forgive the long title. I think this reflects the fact that I never know what I'm going to say in advance, and so I hate conferences that ask me the title several weeks or months before I've written the paper, and so I always come up with sort of titles that could mean anything or nothing, so that I preserve the liberty to say what I decide to do at the last minute. First of all, apologies for speaking in English. I can understand quite a lot of German, but it's not a language I speak well, so you really don't want me to try and give my paper in German. What I'm going to do today is look at British attitudes towards Germany as a European player during particularly the latter half of the 20th century. There'll be occasional reflection about more recent periods, but I'm going to leave that to others to mainly talk about, and occasional glances back at the first half of the 20th century. But I am a post-1945 historian, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. I'm also going to complicate matters slightly, because, and this is really what emerged at the last minute, I'm going to make a fairly systematic comparison between Britain and France in terms of their attitudes towards Germany. Now, I think this is hopefully useful in terms of understanding my argument, but it probably comes out of the fact that we are at the part of the university year where much of my teaching in London revolves around discussing the origins of European integration, and therefore particularly the reasons that the French, who were the initiators of the process, turned to European integration. And in the process of doing that, I realized that the point that I was going to be making about Britain and Germany in this talk was, in a sense, the opposite of what the French did. And therefore, hopefully, the argument would be clarified and amplified by an explicit comparison with France. So what I'm going to be essentially arguing is that France, and this is, I think, a fairly generally accepted historical argument, had, through most of the 20th century, a massive German problem, which it largely turned to Europe to solve. So it devised a European solution to its German problem. What I'm going to be arguing today is that if you look at the British position, the phenomenon was rather different. We did have a German problem, but very quickly after the Second World War, that problem faded for a variety of reasons that I'll try briefly to explain. And because the German problem went away, the British didn't really need France's European solution. But paradoxically, France's European solution then became a problem because it worked so well for Britain. And so that then created the dynamics that I'm going to be exploring in this talk. So, what sort of, in a sense, the starting point would be the first half of the 20th century, where I think it would be fairly uncontroversial to argue that for both Britain and France, the German problem was at the centre of their foreign policy and indeed, in many cases, their domestic policy discussions. Germany posed an existential threat to, or German power posed an existential threat to both countries through large parts of the 20th century. And although Britain and France, in fact, spent most of the time disagreeing about what to do about Germany and squabbling about what the solution might be, they were nonetheless both united by a shared obsession with the Germans. And that remains clearly the case until 1945. But I think the next 5 years mark a crucial divergence in the two countries' approach. For Britain, the first 5 years after the Second World War, so the period where Britain is an occupying power, as of course the French are too, in what will become the Federal Republic of Germany, the British realized sort of very quickly, they arrived in 1945 with many of the sort of punitive instincts that were perhaps totally understandable in the aftermath of a very bitter war, and that they shared with the French. But very quickly, for a number of reasons, they dropped these punitive ideas. The three key reasons I'd highlight for this transformation were firstly their reading of what had gone wrong last time round, what had gone wrong after the First World War, where the British attitude was strongly influenced by the work of John Maynard Keynes, the economic consequences of the peace, and it essentially boiled down to the idea that Versailles had not worked because we were too nasty to Germany. It therefore followed that now that we had an opportunity to, in a sense, do Versailles again, this time round we should not make the same mistake. So that was the first historical factor. The second factor was a practical factor. Britain found itself in charge of the most industrialized and most populous parts of Germany, and therefore just keeping Germany poor was very expensive for Britain. The Ruhrgebiet, etc., cannot feed itself, and therefore Britain really needed the German economy to recover quickly, because if it did not recover quickly, this would place the cost of keeping the German population alive on the British taxpayer, and this was a massive burden that Britain was not in a position to bear. So there was a purely, so this wasn't altruism, this was a purely selfish calculation that pushed Britain towards dropping its punitive strategy. And then the third factor was the growing reality of the Cold War, and the realization that the western zones of Germany were crucial parts of the Western Bloc that would have to fight the Cold War, and therefore they had to be quickly pushed into a position where they were self-sustaining, prosperous, pro-Western and democratic, rather than following out a punitive strategy. So the British, in that 5-year period, moved pretty rapidly from a punitive position to a problem where actually they regarded Germany as a future ally, not as a past enemy to be punished. The French, by contrast, lived those same 5 years much, much more traumatically. For France, those 5 years are a process of very bitter defeat. Time and time again, the French punitive strategy that they still wanted to implement was frustrated. They found themselves, because they very quickly found themselves in a minority within the Allied-controlled Council, within the discussions of Germany, they found themselves outvoted and outmaneuvered by the British and the Americans, and they found themselves pushed into a situation where the Federal Republic was essentially created without them wanting it to happen. And so they found themselves forced to swallow a revived, prosperous, and potentially powerful Germany, which they would not otherwise have wanted to live with. But this frustration, this defeat, became the wellspring or became the source of their moment of genius, because they realized that in order to cope with this, they would have to get as close to the Germans as possible. As I sometimes put it to my classes in London, because you couldn't control Germany from the outside with Allied controls, the only way you could control it was by hugging it, by getting as close as possible. And so rather than just transforming Germany into an ally, as the British had done, the French realized that they had to transform Germany into a partner. And therefore they got much closer than the British. And so paradoxically, the fact that the British relatively easily moved from punitive strategy towards allied strategy meant that they didn't have to get radical in terms of thinking in European terms. They could accept the Federal Republic as a partner, as an allied state with which they did business, with which they had interaction, but which they did not need to get too close to. Whereas the French, because of their continuing worry and obsession about Germany, actually had to get much, much closer. And I think that crucial period in many ways explains the different trajectories that the two countries have taken vis-à-vis Germany ever since. Now, this then leads to the second phase of my argument, namely the fact that by the 1960s, the British are beginning to realize that this French solution to the German problem, namely European integration, has rapidly become a problem for Britain itself. Initially, at least, the British in the 1950s had been content for European integration to happen on its doorstep without them being particularly worried. People who work on this subject sometimes use the phrase benevolent detachment. The British were perfectly content in the 1950s to say, yes, by all means, France and Germany, make Europe. We're happy for you to do so, but we just don't want to participate ourselves. By the late 1950s, however, that British sort of insouciance and readiness to allow Europe to go ahead without it was disappearing. The British realized that actually Europe's success would be a problem for Britain if they didn't get involved themselves. And so in the late 50s, early 60s, you get a British realization, belatedly, that they actually need to take part. At which point, a new role for Germany appears in British attitudes in the form of the hope and expectation that Germany can be Britain's ally in its efforts to get into the European community. And if you look at the period of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, a lot of Britain's hopes of gaining access to Europe revolved around Germany. France was the problem, General de Gaulle was the barrier. The best way of persuading de Gaulle, the best way of getting round the French would be to get the Germans onto your side. It didn't necessarily work very well as a tactic, because ultimately, for many German politicians, the ties with France were more important than the potential advantages of community enlargement. The Germans were very content to be friendly to the British, but not at the expense of breaking their ties with Paris. So, in fact, I think the British were disappointed in their strategy, but they did very much believe that Germany would be their great assistance in getting into Europe. And I think this sets a bit of a pattern. There have been multiple moments in Britain's difficult trajectory and difficult relationship with European integration. Its difficult courtship during the 1960s, its difficult experience of being a member since 1973, where the British have looked to Germany as a German solution to Britain's European problem. So it happened in the 1960s. Not terribly effectively, but somewhat. It would happen again in the early 1980s when the British got into, as some of you may remember, a major row over their budgetary contribution to the European community. Now, Germany, as the other big net contributor, was a key part of the solution to that problem, essentially because if the British were going to be given some of the money that Mrs. Thatcher wanted to get back, that could only happen if the Germans paid rather more themselves. And in the end, at the Fontainebleau summit in June 1984, that is actually what was finally agreed. So there was a sort of feeling that Germany could be the solution to Britain's European problems then. And I think you can see this attitude of looking towards Germany as the potential solution to Britain's European problems much more recently too. Look at the way in which David Cameron's diplomacy, when he was seeking to renegotiate British membership terms prior to the referendum, seemed to revolve almost entirely around the idea of striking a deal with Mrs. Merkel. You can argue too, I think it's unrealistic, but there was some of the way that some of the British are still sort of looking to a sort of German solution to their current Brexit problems. But that's an area I will leave to others to discuss. So there is this recurrent pattern of Britain seeing Germany as a potential solution to their European problem rather than seeing Germany itself as the problem. Whereas I think the French found themselves in this situation where Germany was the problem, therefore Europe became the solution. There is, however, one clear exception to this pattern that was referred to earlier when we were greeted with a reminder about the famous or infamous Chequers discussions of 1990, namely the period surrounding German unification, the fall of the Berlin Wall, etc. For a brief moment during that period of 1989-90, the British did suddenly start talking about German power within Europe as being a major problem. And Mrs. Thatcher was the most outspoken, but there were others too who certainly saw things in that fashion. What was interesting, however, and again I think the contrast with France is instructive, was the way in which again, a way out of that problem was perceived. because many European countries wobbled in 1989-90 in their attitudes towards Germany. I have a long-standing argument with my French colleague Frédéric Bozeau about the extent to which Mitterrand wobbled. He argued he didn't wobble at all. I really can't, so I just don't think that evidence stacks up. There clearly was a wobble. But what's interesting with Mitterrand is very, very quickly, in a sense, this French instinct to solve the German problem by using Europe reasserted itself. And Mitterrand very quickly turned this spike of panic about what a unified Germany might mean into an argument for pressing ahead further and faster with European integration. And this obviously starts a path that will lead to the Maastricht Treaty. The British, or at least Mrs. Thatcher, couldn't go in that direction because for her more Europe was as bad or if not worse a problem than more Germany. And this creates a huge difficulty which paralysed her policy making on the German question. Interestingly, however, Mrs. Thatcher found herself very quickly out of step with the majority of her party and the majority of the British civil service elite, and indeed, actually, with quite a lot of British public opinion. And in the 1989-90, quite a lot of her colleagues were urging her to take a much more European approach, to use Europe as a solution to the German problem. And ultimately, her failure to do so became one of the contributory factor to her fall at the end of 1990. This, therefore, means that the major government which replaces her comes to power with arguably a much more mainstream European position. And it's interesting that the early major years are marked by both an attempt to sound and act in a more pro-European fashion and an attempt to get much closer to Germany. This is the period where major courts, Helmut Kohl very clearly, the Conservatives bring themselves into line and join the European People's Party, which they had previously always shunned. Controversially, of course, they accept money from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which will subsequently come back to bite them in later scandals. And it's no coincidence that Major makes his most famous pro-European speech in Bonn, where he talks about wanting Britain to be at the heart of Europe. That phrase that will resonate and resonates even more strongly perhaps in this era of Brexit. So the British find themselves sort of after this momentary reappearance of the German problem following a much more French path into European thought. However, this turns out to be a little bit of a false dawn. Because what will happen in, as you all remember, in the early to mid-1990s is that the ratification crisis around the Maastricht Treaty, the Danish referendum, the ERM, or the pound's exit from the ERM, etc., will lead to a sort of spasm of anti-European sentiment within the Conservative Party, and in many ways the start of that civil war within the Conservative Party that you can argue has now led us to the situation that we now find ourselves in. So that, although after 1989-90 there was this brief moment when the British pattern seemed to be becoming much more mainstream European, that's proved to be a false dawn, proved to be a short-lived phenomenon, and instead you very quickly get a regression to a much more adversarial, much more difficult relationship. Even in the difficult periods that follow, however, Germany was not really at the heart of Britain's European obsessions. Sometimes anti-European attitudes were expressed in an anti-German fashion. There was at a popular level a certain tendency, over fondness for Second World War analogies, particularly when on the football terraces, and so on, which I think reflects a British educational system where virtually the only form of history that one is ever taught. My kids have just both been through this system. Virtually the only history they ever do is the history of the Second World War, as far as I can work out. There seems to be virtually nothing else taught. So there is I'm not saying that the British have no problem at all with Germany. But in many ways, what's interesting about the British debate about Europe is how uncentered on German power it was, and it has been throughout. The problem is not Germany. The problem for Britain has been Europe, or the process of European integration and the degree to which Britain wants to engage with it. And to the extent that Germany has loomed large at all, and I would argue that compared to many other countries, Germany has actually not loomed very large in the British debate, but to the extent that Germany has loomed large at all, it has more often been as a potential ally, a potential saviour, a potential solution to Britain's European problem, rather than a potential problem in the way that I think it has often, much more often been in the debate elsewhere. So I think I will sort of leave you with this sort of contrasting reaction. The British, unlike the French, did not have a German problem, or at least quickly got rid of their German problem. As a result, they did not have a European solution, but that European solution has become the dominant problem for British politics since that 1950s crossover point, or since the early 1960s at least, and it has been that has created the situation where Britain became a belated member of the European community, had a very bumpy ride within the European community union, and ultimately is now finding itself in the difficult and very bumpy road out of the European Union. Thank you very much.